There comes a point in a lot of big modern cinematic games where I stop playing them properly. I switch from excited discovery to, right, let's just get this done. At the start, I'm an absolute model citizen. I'm doing all the side quests, hunting collectibles, chasing every upgrade, and clearing out all the bandit camps. And I'm putting off the main story for hours because I've spotted something cool in the distance. And to be fair, I'm exactly the sort of person these games are built for. I'm a bit of a completionist with this stuff, and I like knowing I've done all the side content before the big final push. I'm the sort of player who doubles back on himself 3 times because I'm not sure which way progresses the story, and I don't want to be trapped by a cutscene and miss out on an optional goodie. But often I hit the wall, and it's usually around the end of the game's second act, right when the story starts demanding urgency. There's the great big bad, some looming catastrophe, everything is suddenly life or death, all while the game is still dangling optional content at me like we've got all the time in the world.
Show this to Z.
And the more it happens, the less I think it's just me getting impatient. I think a lot of these big cinematic exploration driven games have a pacing problem. And hey, before you get your pitchforks out, I know these aren't all open world in exactly the same way. To some people the phrase just means big map, and to others it means you can ignore the plot entirely and become a mushroom farmer with 7 wives. But whether a game is fully open world, wide linear, or doing something more hub-based and Metroidvania adjacent, it can still run into the same issue once it gives me space to roam, upgrades to chase, and side content to mop up. Because that's the thing, these games don't just allow exploration, they condition you to value it.
You should try taking detours more often.
Early on, that works brilliantly. I'll happily go wandering to get a health upgrade, a better weapon, some new crafting materials, and it's even better when they're blocked by a tough enemy. Seriously, a mini-boss I'm slightly under-leveled for, followed by some overpowered loot for that point in the game. Gorgeous, flawless, perfect. And that early on, when the game puts an ability locked path in front of me, I don't just ignore it, I'll make a note to come back later. The trouble is what happens when the story starts ramping up. Because by that point, the game has spent hours teaching you that detours are useful, unexplored paths are important, and leaving things behind is content that you're missing out on. Yes, you can call me a completionist bastard, I'll totally own it. But when the game starts to demand urgency, and the overall structure of the game hasn't really changed with it, the game starts to pull in 2 different directions. And that loss of momentum doesn't always look the same. In Jedi Survivor, it shows up through progression and delayed payoffs. In God of War Ragnarok, it's tangled up with a story that already struggles to hold on to its momentum. And in Horizon Forbidden West, it's about side content that starts to feel increasingly out of step with the story as it evolves. And to be clear, these are all great games too. You can put your lightsabers, chaos blades, and spears away. This is more about a specific kind of friction they all run into at different points. Because my issue with these games usually isn't that they're big or even that they have too much to do. Well, with one glaring exception. It's that they spend hours teaching you that everything matters, then start losing balance the moment the story picks up momentum. Jedi Survivor is probably the clearest version of this problem for me. I was really excited to continue Cal's story because I'd enjoyed the first game a lot, so waiting for the PC port to reach the advanced technical milestone of able to run was a pain in the arse. I did eventually get to play it, and early on, it's pretty good at making the exploration feel worthwhile. I constantly found myself going off the beaten track to find wee things like those all-important poncho cosmetics, health and force upgrades, and shortcuts that help prevent painful runbacks. Oh, and stims that keep you alive as well. The game was basically always giving me a reason to poke around. And because it borrows a fair bit from the Metroidvania playbook, you know every blocked path is something you'll be circling back to. But it's not just one area doing this. It's multiple areas across multiple planets with long stretches of story where your brain's just lugging around all this unfinished business from hours ago. The issue is that Jedi Survivor often waits far too long to hand over the traversal tools that make all of that stuff pay off. The game drip feeds you traversal abilities throughout the main quest to the point that it's genuinely irritating. So by the time you finally unlock the Ascension cable at quite a pivotal point in the story, it's not just one satisfying, oh I can go back and grab this, it's a whole pile of unfinished chores that are suddenly dumped on you, like that laundry chair in your room. A lot of these abilities are given to you when the plot is ramping up. The story wants momentum, but the structure's still trying to pay off exploration promises it made like hours ago. So instead of feeling like a reward for paying attention, it starts feeling like the game's handed me a backlog at the exact moment I'm meant to care about the story pushing forward. I'm not saying that Jedi Survivor makes exploration feel pointless, it just defers my ability to explore for so long that by the time the payoff arrives, the story's taken place elsewhere. And I have no issue with gated optional content on its own, but the overtuned delayed payoff really interrupted the game's flow for me. I love a new poncho collectible as much as anybody, but exploration should feel exciting in the moment, not because I traipsed my way back to Kobo for something I learned about hours earlier. Switching things up a bit, I remember getting a similar feeling while playing God of War Ragnarok. While Jedi Survivor felt like it gated too much of its optional content until later on in the story, Ragnarok has pacing issues within the story itself, which is exacerbated further by its side content. It makes the detours much more apparent than if the game was more linear. And to be fair, Sony Santa Monica absolutely nailed reviving God of War in 2018. I really enjoyed that game, and having never owned a PlayStation, it was the first Sony PC port I played, before they decided to kill that idea because they hate the money I'd give them for Ghost of Yoti. I'd obviously heard about the originals, but the modern Norse mythology games were the first time I'd actually played as Kratos. I spent a year dodging as many spoilers for Ragnarok as I could while waiting on the PC port to land, and I was super keen to see where the story was going and if it could stick the landing. Which meant that when the story started to drag its feet, I felt it a lot. And for me, some of the worst offenders were the Atreus sections. The clearest example for me is Ironwood. And just to be clear, this is not about Angrboda herself, who I think works well as a character, and I'm not interested in the bad faith nonsense that surrounded her. Ironwood lands at a point where the story started building tension around Atreus and the prophecy, and the relationship between him and Kratos is becoming more and more strained. But then the game shifts into this really long and slow Atreus chapter with yak riding, fruit picking, and a general sense that Ragnarok isn't happening soon. And in isolation, Ironwood's really key for Atreus' character development. It gives him space away from Kratos to become his own person, and it's setting up some of the important giant stuff. But in that moment, it really feels like the game's hit the emergency brakes. The boss fight at the end of the section's good fun. It feels pretty unique, but it just takes so long to get there. That's already a problem on its own. But then Ragnarok piles a frankly huge amount of side content on top of it. The realms are all designed to be revisited, favours keep popping up well into the late game, and even after the credits there's still substantial post-game favours asking for your attention. Some of that new stuff is completely worthwhile, but it adds to the feeling that the game is forcing new ways to keep tidying up the 9 realms. And the amount of puzzles really doesn't help with this either, often leaning more on mechanical faff than actual puzzle solving, which somehow they manage to make even more pointless when your companions shout the answer right away. I am in no rush to revisit some of that late game hex arrow nonsense either. I can easily imagine a more streamlined version of Ragnarok where the story might stumble, but it mostly keeps pace with itself. But it's the extra layers of side content which causes it to lose even more momentum. And of course, I still want to do all the side content. That's the problem, and I know that it's my problem. So the choice becomes powering through a story that already feels a bit slow in places just to preserve some of that momentum, or dragging it out even further because I'm a wee completionist. So that's how I feel about Ragnarok. And I'm not gonna lie, replaying through a chunk of it to capture footage for this video was not super exciting. And to be clear, it's not that Ragnarok has no urgency at all, it's that it builds urgency, then often manages to diffuse it. And that brings us to Horizon Forbidden West, which I'd say is the most open world of the 3, and it again has a slightly different angle to this problem. As the story gathers pace, I feel like the side content really doesn't narrow its focus, and a lot of it stays trapped in the earlier stages of the game. What's funny is, I thought they nailed it at first. In the early game, before reaching the Forbidden West, I didn't feel like the narrative was rushing me, and I was allowed the time to go and get distracted doing optional content in a way that felt quite natural. At that point, the smaller scale side quests work. Helping settlements and doing errands serves as an introduction to new enemies and weapons, and it helps establish the West as an actual place. But as the story ramps up, especially with Gaia really hammering home how little time we have to save the world, I don't feel like the side content really evolves along with it. The stakes are increasing. If we don't restore Gaia's functions, the world is doomed. But then the world's still full of local jobs and contracts asking you to go and hunt a few machines. A lot of these jobs are framed as optional, but because they feed into weapons and upgrades, they don't always feel optional in practice. This is where Horizon gets a little bit weird for me. The story of Aloy operates at like planetary collapse levels. but the optional quests operate at village notice board level well into the game. And I like village notice board quests. There's always a blacksmith missing tools, or someone's missing a husband, which will give me a reward that I'll never use. But when the main story's screaming that the ecosystem of the planet will die in 4 months, I feel like Aloy needs to prioritise a bit better into the late game. And yes, not all of it is a problem. I quite enjoyed the arenas in each village. I didn't enjoy that one board game that I crashed out over constantly, but it all still made sense as part of the world. The issue here isn't just that there's a lot to do, it's that the story continues to get bigger and bigger while all of the side content stays almost stubbornly small. There's a few standouts: the conclusion after taking out all the rebel outposts, and rescuing people from the Bleeding Mark, that's a good one as well. But those work well because they feel connected to the wider world and what's going on in it. A lot of the rest still has mechanical value, and that's part of the problem. It's not as simple as just ignoring it, because the rewards and resources for upgrades all still matter. So maybe the issue is not exactly what the content is, but how much of it the game still asks of me as it narrows that narrative funnel approaching the end of the game. Narrows the narrative funnel. Jesus Christ. Sorry, you did not sign up for that level of wank. There's another thing linking these examples, and I don't think it's accidental. These 3 games are all sequels. And that introduces a particular challenge, because in the first game in a series, side content gets to piggyback on novelty. Even when it's not advancing the main plot, it's still teaching you about the world you're moving through, whether that's the laws of the land, the factions that belong to it, or the kinds of stories that you'll find within it. I think sequels have a slightly higher bar to clear. Not because sequels can't be great, but because the world is no longer entirely new. I already know a lot of the rules, I already have a relationship with the characters and the setting, and I'm not being carried forward by the same first time awe of, what is this place? In the exact same way. An interesting comparison for an open world sequel is actually Middle-earth trademark Shadow of War trademark, because it dodges the issue almost entirely by understanding what people actually carried over from the first game. The real joy in Shadow of War is the Nemesis system, especially once it's fully up and running. That's the thing I'm there for.
I feel like you're just here for this.
The Nemesis system.
What?
That's the sequel promise it actually delivers on. I honestly can't remember seeing any marketing targeted towards the story. It was all about the next version of the Nemesis system. The main missions are just the bits I need to do to make sure the sandbox opens up a bit wider. I'm not there for Talion and Celebrimbor's sexual tension, I'm there for Shelob's toes and being betrayed by an orc called Gorbash the Moist. And Shadow of War feels like it was built with the Nemesis system at its core. Losing track of the story doesn't feel so much like I'm stepping away, it feels more like I'm playing the real game. For the record, I want the Nemesis system freed from the claws of Warner Brothers and crammed into as many games as possible. Yes, even the cozy farming sims. And to be fair, I completely appreciate that Shadow of War was aiming at a different target audience. It didn't really present itself as the grand emotional conclusion to Talion's story. The whole pitch was basically, the Nemesis system's bigger, go have fun with it. I may be trying to justify talking about my love for the Nemesis system here because I was replaying the game while writing this video, but I also want to be clear, I'm not pointing at Shadow of War and saying just do that. This game works well in contrast because it knows the sandbox is the main attraction. Jedi Survivor, Ragnarok and Forbidden West, on the other hand, are asking to be treated as cinematic character-driven stories. So when their side content starts pulling against that, the friction is much harder to ignore.
I am profoundly unimpressed.
So what does this all mean? I've been trying to pinpoint exactly what bothers me the most about all of it, and I think it's that when the pacing starts to wobble, it doesn't just make the game feel a bit awkward, it also changes the context the side content sits in. Early on, side content feels like part of the journey. It feels like preparation. You're getting stronger, you're learning about the world, you're picking up tools, and you're building yourself up for whatever the story's moving towards. But when the story starts to demand urgency, that exact same content starts feeling completely different. It's no longer preparation, it's delay. When a game starts gently asking you to ignore its dramatic climax, the same contract, favour, collectible loop that felt fine 10 hours ago suddenly feels different. You're not doing it because it belongs in the journey anymore, you're doing it because the game's still insisting it matters, even though the narrative's begging you to get on with it. And that's why just come back later never really feels like a satisfying answer either. Because yes, technically you can. If the game lets you keep playing after the ending, you can absolutely come back and mop up all the side stuff you skipped. I do it all the time. But by then, the reward's gone a bit stale. If the big fights are behind me and all the main narrative threads are finished, then some gear with better stats doesn't quite hit in the same way. So I think the problem isn't just that these games have too much to do, it's that they don't always seem to realise when they've passed the point when all the optional content has changed meaning. And I appreciate that designing a game for different types of players must be an absolute nightmare. There are ways around this though, and since we're talking about great games, Silksong's Act 3 is an excellent example of keeping optional content relevant. Light spoilers obviously, but the thing I like about that late game shift is that the world actually changes with the story. Farloom feels altered, the stakes feel higher, and while there's still light-hearted side content, the new side quests feel like they belong to that new, worse version of the world. That makes late game optional content feel less like a stale cleanup. The world's clearly moved on, and it's not pretending to still be in Act 1 demanding you collect 6 beetle arses. The optional content in Act 3 feels much more like it's part of the escalation than leftovers from before it. I don't actually think this is a problem every open world game has. A lot of Bethesda games avoid it almost by accident, just because the main story's never really treated as urgent in the first place. Yes, technically Alduin is a world-ending threat. Yes, finding your son is maybe important. Yes, the stars are in a field. But the overall structure of Bethesda titles is specifically built around you wandering off and doing your own thing. The fact I need to create my own character as well means that it doesn't feel out of place either. I've made my own wee guy, of course. He's free to get distracted. That's the whole point. And then you've got something like Mass Effect, and honestly Baldur's Gate 3 gets this right too, and I don't think I can call them open world in quite the same way, but they avoided a lot of this because their optional content feels directly tied to the main journey. Companion quests matter because the companions matter. Your choices matter because plot lines reflect those decisions. So slowing down the urgency to spend time with those characters doesn't always feel like stepping away from the story. Most of the time it feels like that is the story. Even when those games take their time, they're not pulling me in the opposite direction. Unless of course your Mass Effect 2's Firewalker DLC. The games that struggle with this the most are specifically the ones framed as cinematic blockbusters. The ones that want the emotional urgency of a tightly paced story while holding on to an open world structure that offers hours upon hours of extra content. So that's the one bit I think these games keep tripping over. Not freedom, not scale, not even side content on its own. Just timing. Because if you spend half the game rewarding all my completionist habits, you have to accept that those habits are coming with me into the final act. So yeah, this was not designed to be a massive takedown of open world games. I started writing about a specific feeling I had, and it's just turned into this. Maybe this is just a me problem, but I'd be curious if this was something else people are feeling too. And honestly, my main goal was to stop myself disappearing into a deeper dive and this video taking forever. I didn't want to post the Halo video and then just vanish. So cheers for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.